All right, let's dive into a massive Supreme Court case that came with a staggering $129 billion price tag. At its heart was a really simple but really important question.
Could a president, all on their own, decide to tax pretty much everything coming into the country? I mean, it sounds like a hypothetical, but for a while there, it absolutely wasn't. The whole thing really kicked off in 2025 when the White House took a little-known law and decided to use it in a very, very big way.
So, how in the world did we get here? Let's back up and walk through the timeline. It all started in early 2025. The Trump administration unveiled the sweeping new tariff plan. The justification they gave was that it was a crucial tool to fix trade imbalances and to protect national security.
And their entire legal case rested on this one law, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEEPA. But here's the really wild part. This law was originally passed back in 1977 to limit a president's emergency powers. And now, decades later, it was being used to justify one of the biggest unilateral tax hikes in modern American history. The economic fallout from these tariffs was immediate. And for a lot of businesses, especially smaller ones, it was just devastating. They really had no choice but to take on the White House in court.
You had companies from all over the map, like Learning Resources, an educational toy maker, and V.O.S. Selections, a wine importer. They both basically said these tariffs would drive them out of business. So for them, this wasn't just about policy, it was literally about survival. And this number, wow, it just perfectly illustrates the scale of the problem. For Learning Resources, a family-owned business, their costs tied to these tariffs shot up by 44 times. I mean, that's not just a bad quarter. That's an existential threat to your entire company. So this all brings us to the real heart of the legal fight. It all boiled down to a huge disagreement over what the words in that 1977 law actually meant. And you can see the two sides were miles apart. The administration's argument was, look, the law says the president can regulate imports. That's a broad power, and we believe it includes the power to tax. But the businesses challenging this fired back saying, hold on a second. The Constitution specifically gives the power to tax to Congress. If Congress wanted to give that power away, they would have used the word tariff. They didn't. And that's when this case went from being about tariffs to being about something way bigger, the fundamental separation of powers in the U.S. government. The challengers brought up two really powerful legal ideas. First, the non-delegation doctrine, which is basically a rule that says Congress can't just hand off its core duties, like taxing, to the president. And second, the major questions doctrine, which says that if the executive branch is going to make a huge decision with massive economic and political impact, the law has to be crystal clear. You can't just find that kind of power in a vague phrase. So after climbing the judicial ladder, the case finally landed at the Supreme Court. The whole country was watching when oral arguments were held on November 5th, 2025. And then, on February 20th, 2026, the verdict came down. It was a decisive 6-3 ruling against the administration. So what was the big takeaway? The Supreme Court decided that the president had in fact exceeded the authority granted to him under that old 1977 law. Chief Justice Roberts, writing for the majority, put it pretty bluntly. He said the power to tax is a fundamental power of Congress. If Congress was going to hand that enormous power over to the president, it had to do so with a clear, direct, unmistakable statement. And in this law, that clear statement was nowhere to be found. But you know, winning in court was really just the first step. Now came the next massive challenge. How do you get all that money back? And we're talking about a truly mind-boggling amount of money. By the end of 2025, the government had already collected an estimated $129 billion in these tariffs that the Supreme Court had just declared illegal. Now, getting a refund wasn't automatic. It turned into this incredibly complex legal and administrative process. And it all came down to this one key customs term, liquidation. That's basically just when customs officially finalizes and closes the books on an imported shipment, and your path to a refund depended entirely on that status. And this table just shows you what a tangled mess it was. If your shipment was still unliquidated, meaning the paperwork was still open, you were in pretty good shape. But for the millions of shipments that were already liquidated or finalized, businesses had to either file a formal protest within a strict 180-day window, or if they missed that deadline, they had to file a whole new lawsuit. So, the Supreme Court's ruling slammed one particular door shut for imposing tariffs. But this story definitely isn't over. The administration immediately started talking about looking at other laws to accomplish the same goals. And that leaves us with the big, lingering question. Did this landmark case put a real permanent check on presidential power? Or did it just force the White House to find a different path to the same destination?